Good. Well, thank you very much. It's indeed an honor to have this award. And I see many, many prospective awardees out there, so keep it up. Let's get right to it. This emblematic bit of film was taken of case WJ over 50 years ago, and gave rise, in 1962, gave rise to a lot of the so-called popularization of left brain, right brain. It was so interesting and so provocative that the pre-PBS network called NET came in and wanted to see it for themselves, and they stole this bit of film that I had taken through a friend. The friend wound up to be Baron Wallman, who started Rolling Stones magazine. This is a prelude of my life, which is you never know who you're looking at and what they become. So here is WJ in that first bit.
If speech originates in the left half of the brain, are there any functions special to the other half? Here, a split brain subject provides the answer. As he tries to copy this pattern with blocks, we discover his ability is confined to his right half brain.
Now let's remember that the left hand is governed from the right hemisphere, and you will see that he has absolutely no problem in solving the problem. When the patient tries to solve the problem with his right hand, which is governed from the left hemisphere, we find that he is not capable of doing it. Namely, that the right hand, which is governed from the left hemisphere, is intrinsically incapable of performing this kind of visual constructional task. It's interesting to note that the whole perspective is gone. He has 3 and 1 block combinations. It doesn't even square them up. You can see the left hand once. Well, we've now seen that the left hand can perform the problem and that the right hand cannot. Now the question becomes, what happens when you allow both hands together to try to solve the problem? And what we find out is that they fight over each other. One hand knows how to do it, and one hand does not, and so they more or less swallow.
So you can imagine the powerful impact of that, and the notion that there are now 2 minds in one brain, and one side can have certain capacities and the other another. But here we go, case VP, East Coast case, 1982, an operation that included the corpus callosum, so she qualified as a split brain subject. And 20 years later, same test, same result.
They all have 2 white sides, 2 red sides, and 2 sides that are not connected. And 2 are put together. With 1 hand at a time, and start with your left hand. Put them together to make it fun.
Can I turn my angle so I can see it better?
You want to see it?
Yeah, if I turn my angle, I can see it better.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Okay, good. Next one with your right hand.
Well, you get the idea. She can't do it in a completely New York-based experimental psych room, horns outside, everything going on, and a couple things going on in the room. And the young woman administering that test is my wife, Charlotte, who verifies the observation that behind every successful man, there's a surprised woman. So there we go. So, so then to just show you the richness and powerfulness of the syndrome, this is the same case, VP, at the same time giving a rather standard bedside neurologic exam by our young colleague Bruce Volpe at the time. And just in this one bedside exam, you can almost see the full split brain syndrome in terms of its disconnection and the power of each separated hemisphere. And so at the end of this film, you should feel it, feel the power of this syndrome. Here we go.
And I hold up my hands. You tell me how many fingers you see, all right?
All right. 1. 1.
Where?
On your left hand.
You see anything else?
No.
Okay. Well, let's put your hands like this. And I'm going to ask you to show me, mimic what you see with either this hand or this hand. Okay?
Okay.
You look right at my nose. Look right at my nose now. No shaking.
Your nose.
I know, it's tough to see.
I think mine wants to be.
Well, thank you. I'm one of those too. Look right here at my nose now. Show me with your right hand what you see. Okay. Put it down, relax. Show me with your left hand what you see.
1.
Good. Okay, you look right at my nose. You see that? You got it. Good. Look right at my nose.
Okay.
Show me with your, do you see anything now?
You know.
Any finger? Any fingers?
No. Well, you're like this.
Okay. Show me with your left hand what you see. Mimic with your left hand. Good. Very good.
Oh man, don't see it. Just do it.
Look at, what did you just show me? What do you see? You see?
My finger.
Good. Terrific. I don't think there's anything else to ask. I think
Let's just for the fun of it do
play.
Just your fist.
Okay. How about now?
2 fingers.
2 fingers. Okay. Now when I say go, I want you to mimic what you see with your hands. Don't tell me anything. All right?
Oh, okay.
All right? Do it with your hand too. Okay. Now do it again. What do you see now? Both hands. Good. Okay. We're going to try to move too fast. Ready? Don't do it until I tell you to go, all right?
All right.
Go. Okay. Relax. What do you see? Tell me first. What do you see?
Finger. 1.
Good. Now show me with both hands. Good. Okay. Relax. What do you see?
1 finger in his hand. 1 finger in his hand.
Okay. Show me now with your hands.
So there it is. Although I don't see it, I just did it, she said in that one exam. So here we had the separated brains carrying out their respective tasks on one not knowing really anything about the other, except as they came to learn over the years that they had to account for that, but we'll get into that later. So finally, just to capture the flavor of the real behavior, here's case JW a few years after surgery, and you get to see more of the actual, more mental things that are demonstrably separated Here is a bit of a film that was taken of one of our research projects.
Right. Okay, you ready? Right, stop. Great. Good.
When Joe focuses on a point, everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech. So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture, Joe is easily able to name it. Close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work here. Okay, what do you got there? Okay, very good. Now, when a word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain.
Good draw.
Okay.
What do you see?
So even though he can't name it, his left hand is able to draw it.
So all of these findings over a number of years gave rise to the split brain syndrome, as indicated here. We're all familiar with it by now. If a normal person fixates a dot on that screen and asks what they say they see the word key and ring. But after split brain surgery, they would simply say they saw the word ring. The other hemisphere, in fact, saw the word key, and you can demonstrate that both understood it, can organize a response to it, and all the rest. And at this point in the lecture, one could go through all the things that I've done, or we've done, the lab's done. Allow for the disconnection effects, allowed for studying cortical-subcortical relationships, sensory motor and cognitive specificity of fiber pathways, normal variation of callosal projections. We got to those using MRI and MEG and more. Agenesis of the callosum and the impact on development, interhemispheric transfer and coordination, tracking perceptual cognitive events in real time. All of this indicating that there was great specificity to that great neuronal bundle called the corpus callosum, that specific areas carried out specific functions. And very recently, Carl Doran has tracked this in real time by tracking the bandwidth of the oscillations. And in this video, you can see how information presented in the left visual field initially. These images are flipped, hits the right visual areas, goes forward through anterior regions, and gets over to the other hemisphere. In the area of human laterality, we have all the left versus right stories, the semantic, the imaginal, the perceptual, the attentional, the musical, emotional, interpreter capacities that varied from one brain to the other. We have variation in lateral organization in language and motoric functions in particular. Apparent increased capacity, that you split the brain, you can do more. This hasn't quite hit the popular generation yet, but it's coming. Changes in cognitive and social processes have come late into the game and are fascinating. And overall, the issue of modularity, that just as it's become a mantra now, that the notion that there are all these processes and sub-processes that somehow need to interact to form this perceptual cognitive unity that we think we enjoy. And so that gave rise to the discovery of the interpreter, the cross-cueing and self-cueing strategies that enable that, and all the rest of it, the right brain interpreter and blah, blah, blah. So local action became very powerfully a concept more than central planning, that all these modules may be interacting at a normal, at a very local level, and are not the product of central planning. Anyway, this storyline and that arc and the experiments that back it up are in this book that I just wrote. And the beauty of the book is that it has links to these videos I've just shown you a snippet of that allow the reader to actually see the experiments and judge for themselves. So they're great for teaching. Now, as I wrote this book, I thought it would be just a straight scientific survey. And as I sat down to write it, I realized that this image of the scientist working alone and thinking up all these things is nuts. That there's nothing like that going on. It comes out of friendships, interactions with all kinds of people. And you realize that, in fact, we're very much a social animal. And these social relationships start early, and they continue through life. And it's in those social interactions that the richness of the metaphors that we apply to scientific situations becomes real. So I'm a great believer in the idea that you'll ask anybody anything and make use of it starting very early in life. Now for me, it all started here. Well, I thought I was, there it is. Remember this?
Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology. Don't know much about science. Don't know much about the French I took.
That so describes me. I was not playing with my chemistry set in the garage. I went to college to learn something, and to show you how much I needed to learn, I joined a fraternity called Alpha Delta Phi, better known as the Animal House. And in honor of that now defunct university, not university, but college, what am I trying to say? Fraternity, there we go, I got it. I have on my Animal House insignia here because I was the character Giraffe. And anyway, what I learned there was that there's got to be more to life than this. And I became interested in science while at Dartmouth. And I also became interested in the work of Roger Sperry and his work on neurospecificity, which is absolutely intriguing. And he had written an article in Scientific American that captured my imagination, and I wrote to him as a junior in college and said, say, I live next door to CalTech, what are the chances of a summer fellowship? And by gosh, he wrote back and said, sure, come on over. I went into the lab, and there they were, working on split brains of all kinds, animals, mostly cats, monkeys. And so they said, just go to work, you do something too. And those were the kinds of instructions you had in those days. So I decided to try to see if I could anesthetize a rabbit, half of a rabbit's brain. And this required injecting things into the internal carotid and all this kind of stuff. And it was so exciting. And I did it for 3 months. And at that, decided that I did not want to go to medical school. I wanted to go into basic research. And went back to Dartmouth, and and the advice to young scientists is when you think you want to do something, just write the letter and it just may happen. So getting started was, there were 28 callosum patients, 26 callosum patients in Rochester that had been operated on 20 years before. And that Rochester was close to Hanover, New Hampshire, Dartmouth. So I wrote another letter. I wrote to these guys who were in charge, the medical people in charge of those patients. And they said, yeah, sure, come on down and test them. And so loaded with these ideas that came out of the summer at CalTech, well, first thing you have to do is you have to get a grant. So I wrote a little grant to the Hitchcock Foundation. They gave me a couple $100 to go rent a car, get a hotel. And off to Rochester. And by the time I got to Rochester, the gentleman to your left had thought better about this kid from Dartmouth coming in to test his patients. So I drove the car to Boston to see my brother, and that was the end of that. So, but that all gave rise to going to CalTech and to turning out over 5 years this basic set of papers that looked at the different psychological functions, the motoric, the somatosensory organization, the visual capacities, the language capacities, and of the split brain patients. And that all, for the quick summary of that, last year, PNAS had a request to write a commentary on their 100th anniversary of patients that from science that had noteworthy impact, and certainly the split brain work did. And so a quick summary of that is there. Now, what I want to get to, though, is, well, how does this all happen? You know, what is it? And a big factor is the institutional environment. And I personally can't say enough for CalTech and the social norm that is there. And it's the norm do important things. So what does that mean? Well, it means when you start your graduate career and you start kicking around ideas with people and you start seeing this frown come over their face, you know, that's not a good one, you know. And all this sort of feedback and richness of the community, that the goal is try to think of a better and better experiment and do it. And Caltech had that, and one of the reasons they had it, because the minute you walked in the front door, you were an equal with the famous professors. You were in discussions with them. And so if you just look, I mean, in some way you couldn't avoid it because of the way the institution was. It was not particularly large, it was small. But look at this one floor. There was SPERRY's office. There was my office, a kid who barely shaved. There was A.H. Sturtevant, Ed Lewis. These are giants in genetics. Down here was Ray Owen, the father of immunology. Oh, there's Linus Pauling back there. These are the people you bumped into the hallway with. And it was at a time when everybody took an interest in everybody, and they weren't looking at their iPhone, right? And so it became a very rich community. And here are some of the poster childs of Caltech. There's Richard Feynman, Linus Pauling, Murray Gell-Mann, Sturtevant, Max Delbruck, Seymour Benzer, Renato Del Becco. And these guys walked the hallways. They stopped you and asked you. They came into your lab and they would ask you questions. And that, I think, is pretty much gone today, but it was part of the scene. And these guys, as you know, all went on to Nobel Prizes, and the two that weren't clicked there should have gotten them. So I was in the SPERRY lab, and SPERRY himself, of course, was a genius and a giant. And in the lab, right here, you will see then who were graduate students, I mean, undergraduate students, so I was a graduate student, you know, big thing. The problem is at Caltech, the smartest people are the undergraduates, then the graduate students, then the faculty. That's the Caltech lore, anyway, as you might imagine. But there's Steve Hilliard, Murray Sherman, Eric Young, the great Joe Bogan, the neurosurgeon that brought the patients to us, Mitch Klickstein, the great neuroscientist, and Colin Trevarthen, who went into developmental work, and the other two guys you've never heard of. But here is the big deal, the patients. So the first group of patients that really made the story was WJ, NG, and LB. And here they are in various scenes. The two on the right are scenes showing how utterly normal they seemed after their surgery. You would not know that they were, in fact, possessing of divided minds. They looked completely normal. You had to pull this out of them through all the tests that I've described here. And so overall, it came out to this kind of view of a distributed system. There's modules with specificity throughout the brain, and somehow the chore was to continue to identify these and find the networks that keep them together. It got a little oversold, as we all know, with the left brain, right brain, but you know, what the hell. So, oh yeah. So we just heard a lecture from Alan Alda on why scientists are such lousy speakers, and they hide behind this thing, he says, and then they hide behind PowerPoints. So for the first time in my life, I went out and bought this thing. And if he's right, I can change this slide. Yep, he's right. So this puts me, oh, and the other thing we do is we look at the back of the room. I don't want to actually see any of your expressions. We don't want to relate. We're terrified and want to get the hell out of here, right? So that's the deal. So you're seeing an old dog trying to learn a new trick here. But some tricks I did learn earlier in life was, while you want to keep the day job, go ahead and do all the other things you also want to do. And for me, I was interested in politics as a young graduate student. And in a sort of a flamboyant sort of way, I must say, Jack Kennedy had been through town, President Kennedy, at the Hollywood Palladium talking about foreign policy. That was a big deal, big media event. So I say to myself, why don't I rent the Hollywood Palladium and have a debate on Jack Kennedy's foreign policy? So Barry Goldwater was passing through town, so I find a way to get him, and I say, Barry, here, help me promote this event I'm going to have at the Hollywood Palladium. Well, what is the event? Well, the event was a debate between William F. Buckley and Steve Allen, right? And it was on the foreign policy of John F. Kennedy. And the 20 minutes before the debate, 2 hours, be realistic, 2 hours, I'd sold 200 tickets to this 3,000-seat auditorium. Lo and behold, at the time of the event, which was, I think at 8 o'clock, 7:30, 3,000 people showed up. Place was packed. The debate started. They really went at each other with great fun, great civility, but fun. And it turned out, sitting in the front row was Groucho Marx, right? So Buckley sees Groucho Marx, and with his debating skill immediately says, let's face it, Steve, the foreign policy of John F. Kennedy might as well have been written by the Marx brothers. At which point, Groucho gets up with his famous cigar, struts on the stage, place goes nuts, I remain solvent, and life goes on. Came out in a little book, finally put together 3 of these debates and came out in a little book, and it was great fun and contributed to the dialogue at the time. 4 days later, the tragedy, one of the great tragedies in America happened, and I was about to hang it up in being involved in politics, but I remained friends with both Allen and Buckley invited me to the 64 Republican Convention because he needed people to help work for him. And so my job was to take care of John Dos Passos, the great American author. And my job was to take him around privately, which meant 20-hour days of going through San Francisco, making sure he made all his commitments, and also typing his article out the last night, which required me to stay up all night long. And I handed it in the next morning to Buckley, and I saw him at noon, and he says, Mike, typing is not your strong hand. So I quickly ended my life in journalism and politics, even though I met these guys at the convention and Baldwin a few months later, and it was great fun. But what it really did was get me sold on the notion of intellectual battles, of putting together people who really don't think the same way. And so I've really done a lot of that. And with Buckley, I carried it on, and here is the example on his firing line shows. I started to feed him great psychologists to talk about the issues of the day. And there's Dave PREMACK and Nate Asbrin having it out on one of his shows. The next show was B.F. Skinner and Don Mackay looking at issues of free will. And the final one I put together for him was Skinner talking to Leon Festinger on the mechanisms of moral development. So what you do is when you have all these extra science relationships, everybody's influencing everybody. I'm influencing, in this case, Buckley. Buckley's influencing me in many ways, and it just becomes a much richer life. And I took this idea of intellectual debates into our field, of course, and these are some early pictures of what our Cognitive Neuroscience Institute did. We had exotic meetings in places like KUSADASI and MOOREA, and if you look closely at this picture in MOOREA, there's Mike Posner, there's Steve Hilliard, there's Gary Lynch, there's Stan Schachter, there's Leon Festinger, there's Eric Warner, who paid for it all. Over here in MOOREA, a meeting that was on, I forget what that meeting was on, it was such a good time. But this was a meeting on memory, and here we had Francis Crick, who was just getting into neuroscience, And here we had Duncan Luce, Ira Black, Herb Kalaki, and Leon, a total mix of people. And yet the meeting was vibrant, interesting, challenging, and it really, all these ideas and interactions help us give rise to formulating the structure of cognitive neuroscience. So, and then and I wanted to make the point, so while I was trained in biology at CalTech, my getting to know Festinger produced all kinds of richness for me. We formed these study groups in New York. Dave PREMACK was part of them, Stan Schachter, and we would go travel to wonderful places. It had the exact, the immediate product for Leon. He wrote his book on the human legacy, which is a fabulous book if you haven't read it. And then we dealt with these issues like selection versus instruction, like origins of thoughts. And all of these, of course, led to my own musings on those topics as well. And then actual experiments with PREMACK. This is my example. Everybody in this room has an example of an experiment that they did they think is really cool, but nobody else does. Right? It's amazing. So PREMACK, had this wonderful principle of the motivation that very simply stated more probable behaviors will reinforce less probable behaviors. And I said, come on, Dave, give me a break. That can't possibly be true. I said, let's take the dipsic rat. You make a lesion in the lateral hypothalamus, a rat stops drinking. Do you think that if we give a rat and a dipsic rat the opportunity to run, he's going to start drinking? That's nuts, right? He said, oh yeah? So he sends me a refrigerator in New York with this gadget in it that allows you to measure these things. And I did this experiment, which is you make the lesion. In fact, you have your baseline measures. The animal prefer to run, but he's certainly not drinking, so you got zero baseline there. And then, in order to have the opportunity to run, he has to drink. Will the animal drink? Drinks like a drunken sailor, right? So the excitement of those kinds of interactions leading to very important ideas within people who worry about recovery of function and the possible mechanisms in neuroscience have got to think about these kinds of phenomena, where psychologists, physiologists, biologists, we get together. So this doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that your core interest and your core expertise doesn't want to be satisfied with more and more studies about things you've thought of to do. And when we moved east, we soon had the opportunity to take advantage of 3 new neurosurgical series, one at Dartmouth by Don Wilson and Dave Roberts, one at Ohio by Mark Rayport, and one at Yale by Dennis Spencer. And these various neurosurgical groups called us at Cornell to come and do some experiments on their split brain subjects. So here were the East Coast patients that then complemented the West Coast patients, case PS, JW, and VB. And this is where we discovered the idea of the interpreter. This is work really carried out jointly by Joe Ledoux and myself. And here in the story, the top screen there shows how we started. 2 or 3 of these patients lived in Vermont, and so we had to go to them, and some of them lived in trailers, and we took the family car, and I had a little trailer, as you can see right there, and we would drive through the winter icy roads of Vermont to get to their house, plug in, and do our experiments. And that was fine, except it was slightly terrifying. So Joseph and I then were wising up, and we moved to New York, and really realized that there were bigger things in life than icy roads in Vermont, and we should be safe. And so we were putting in for an NSF grant, and I said to him, just we were about to send it in, I said, Joseph, have you seen the new Eleganza? It is fantastic. 26 foot, it's got a kitchen, bathroom, bedroom. Could set up a lab in there and live upright. He says, yeah. I said, I'm going to put it in on the grant here, but I need a budget justification. Could you write the budget justification? Well, Joseph writes like a dream. I mean, you know, it's fantastic. And so we put the thing in, 9 months goes by, you hear, you know, you don't know if you have any self-worth, all those things. Phone rings, NSF guy. Well, Mike, there's good news and there's bad news. And I said, well, what's the bad news? You didn't get the grant. So what's the good news? You got the eleganza. That's it. That's it. So it all came because Joseph, who you will meet shortly, carries that great attitude. You talk for a while about something, then you just do it. Just try it. And we tried it, and we never regretted it. So this is where we did, in those days, we discovered this notion of the left hemisphere has a special system in it we call the interpreter. And I won't go through this because probably most of you know about it. But it's the notion that it took us 25 years. This is 25 years into split brain research. We typically used to ask the patients when you show a picture like this, what did you see? And they would say, I saw a chicken claw. And then later on, they could point to a picture that matched the thing that went to the right hemisphere. And we go, yes, that's the split brain effect. 25 years we did that. And then finally, we had the bright idea of saying, well, when they respond like that, you know, it's kind of point to two different pictures at the same time. Why don't we ask them, why did they do that? Why did they do that? Not what did you see, but why did they do that? So we set up the experiments, gave them each a little simple problem to solve. Chicken claw obviously goes with the chicken. The snow scene obviously goes with the shovel. One's going to one hemisphere, disconnected from the other. They respond like you see in the cartoon. And finally, we asked the question, why did you do that, Paul? And he immediately said, oh, that's easy. Chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. All right. I remember Joseph, we're sitting there just stunned. Just stunned. And anyway, so that became a driving concept. And here's another case, JW, where what's happening, just so you get the background here, the left hemisphere, of course, is seeing the word red, and the right hemisphere, the non-talking right hemisphere, is seeing the word banana.
What do you got there?
Oh, banana. Red. See red anyway. Yeah, banana. Fruit, one or the other.
Good. Good drawing.
I couldn't think of how else you was going to draw a red thing, so I grabbed a red pen. It was the first time I've seen a color.
Why did you pick banana?
Just the easiest to draw with his hand, because his hand can pull down and everything.
Okay.
This is so spooky, because you and I are doing this all day long. We're constantly telling a story that fits our narrative as to why we're doing our latest nutty thing, right? Fabulous. Why, oh, never mind, how to get off of that. But, so on to New York, and I'm going to make this fast. And there you have two of the great neurologists in the world, Fred Plum and the greatest neurologist in the world, Jerry Posner, Mike's brother, and of course, George Miller, known to all of you. These were the people that came in an inviting way to us and said, come and let's do a neuroscience of human patients and human disorders. And when you go and live for 10 years, as we did at New York Hospital with George at Rockefeller and Jerry over at Memorial Sloan Kettering, we started trying to put cognitive science and neuroscience together. And this distributed brain system then took on new meaning, where we would see various patients in the hallway, in the hospital at Cornell. We would bring George Miller there on rounds, and he would see these focal diseases, whether it's aphasia, whether it's reduplicative paramnesia, whether it's productive anomia, whether it's amusica. These are all videos, which I'm not going to show because they take too much time. But this punctate, distributed focal capacity kept coming up time and time again. And it reminded me of the astonishing fact, one of the astonishing facts of split brain patients, is when a patient's brain is divided to control their epilepsy, and they wake up from surgery, you would think they would comment on the fact that everything to the left of fixation they can no longer talk about from their left hemisphere. I want to have my brain split because I want to say, I bet I would. But you come to the incredible idea that consciousness about a point in space, about a domain, about a this, about a that, is located to those processes that enable that domain. So we're happy to say, well, this is where space is done. This is where certain kinds of perceptual activity done. This is where certain kinds of thoughts are generated. All the rest of it. Could it be that the mechanisms that enable one to be conscious of those things when those come into consciousness are actually local to that area? And you get thinking about it, and you realize that, take a normal person, look out at the world, and there's the integrated visual world, and we have no problem realizing that we don't talk about stuff back here that's outside of our total sensory sphere. We're not conscious of it. So with split brain surgery, what happens is that comes all the way over to the midline with respect to the left hemisphere. So all the modules that are in there doing their business in terms of the overall brain are the things that enable local conscious experience. So the Cornell days were rich. We were doing, I just skip all that, with innovations. And they not only were the MRI, the MEG, the ERPs, they were also great advances in experimental psychological procedures, the Purkinje eye trackers. All this stuff came in to bring greater specificity and knowledge to the notion of what parts of the brain enable what parts of our mental life. So there we were at Cornell and Rockefeller. And Rockefeller has this great bar. And every evening for almost 10 years, or at least not every evening. Not every evening. But George Miller and I would go over for a drink. And the bar has this really annoying cartoon. It's two guys sitting around a fire looking at it, and the caption is, "Yeah, but so he invented fire. What's he done lately?" Right? This is to motivate their professors. You think you're a big deal? No, come on, keep going. So we used to laugh about that and everything. And we basically generated the notion that cognitive science needs some constraints from neuroscience, and neuroscience was in desperate need of some theory. So the notion of cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience was born. And all these people, every one of them famous and helpful, Steve Hilliard, Brenda Milner, Sue Corkin, Tulving, Mort Mishkin, there's Mike Posner, Beatsy, Floyd Bloom, Steve Pinker, Helen Neville, PREMACK, Roger Shepard, Alfonso Karamazza. It's an all-star cast. They came through, and they, in fact, are what gave life to the program and allowed us to continue. And the trick of it was that the Sloan Foundation, you got to know about the mechanics. The Sloan Foundation gave money to a little 501c3 we started, which is a nonprofit thing. And then we started giving money to these seminars. And then we started the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. and the James S. McDonald Foundation heard all this stuff going on. They liked it, so they started their program. And bingo, you have cognitive neuroscience. And we started the Institute, which remains a great joy to all of us, that Ron Mangan now is the director of. And there's one of our first groups, I bet some of you are in the audience here, from the Tahoe section of that meeting where we produce these books. So finally, let me close on one last thing that's important. If I have, yes, I have 5 minutes. And that is, when you get to be an old geezer, people come around and say, well, why don't you, talk about some public issues? So in 2001, I was asked to be on the President Bush's Council on Bioethics. And Leon Cass, the director, called me up and said, why would you do this? And I said, but I'm not a bioethicist. And he said, you don't have to be. You don't have to be. We talk about bioethical questions, but we want people from all kinds of diverse areas to come. So I did, and it was an exhilarating 7 years, intellectually charged, lots of disagreement, but an incredible learning issue. And one of the things we initially tackled was the stem cell issue. And the stem cell issue is a hot potato because it deals with the moral status of the embryo and what does neuroscience have to say about that, and so on. And you also talk about things like free will and determinism in the law. And I wrote a little book about it. And evaluating free will, now you're hitting some hot button questions, right? My experience, when you talk about free will, people don't actually know or care how you came to your position. They just want to know your position. Do you believe in it or don't you believe in it? So this found a bunch of us in this room, actually. Tim Wilson, Mike Posner, at the Vatican, hashing out what we all thought about free will. And this was a powerful experience. Can't help but being a powerful experience, being in that historic place. I came home, and I remember feeling pretty puffed up about it. So my wife says to me, so, Big Shot, did you have an effect? I was waiting for this one, absolutely waiting for this one. So I said, well, I don't know, but a month later he resigned. So you never know. You never know. So to conclude, we started off with left brain, right brain, and we're basically over the years pushing for the fact, well, that's a start, but actually it's a multi-modular system, and how are we to think about that? And I think we start by thinking what Joe thinks about the fact that he has two hemispheres.
Left hemisphere and right hemisphere now are working independent of each other, but you don't notice it. Now you just kind of adapt to it. You don't have any feeling different than it did before.
So what we're now dealing with, that we have really the disconnected brain is really aggregating different systems with different modules, and the capacities there are defined by what happened to be in that group of disconnected entities. And I think if we think about this a little further, we come back to William James. He pointed out whenever two people meet, there are really 6 people present. There's each man as he sees himself, each man as the other person sees him, and each man as he really is. So how many more would William James say there are with this point of view? And to all of you who made it work, thank you. These are my students, fellows. Thank you very much.